Can you stay here tonight? The ranch had a way of waking before the sun, long before the horses stirred or the wind rolled across the dry grass. He was already up, boots laced, flashlight clipped to his belt, making his first round along the perimeter fence. His name didn't matter as much as the role he carried. A single black father, a security guard trusted to keep the place safe through the long nights when everyone else slept. He worked for a sprawling ranch on the edge of a quiet rural town where the land stretched wide and secrets traveled faster than truth. His life was simple, deliberate. Morning started with coffee strong enough to bite back and ended with checking on his young son before bed, making sure homework was done and prayers were said. No chaos, no surprises. He preferred it that way. The town knew him as reliable, quiet. The kind of man who nodded politely at church and kept to himself after service. Sundays were routine. He sat near the back pew, his son beside him, listening more than speaking. People whispered sometimes, not unkindly, just curious. A widower hour raising a child alone. A man who worked nights instead of chasing promotions. He didn't correct them. He had learned that explaining your life rarely changed people's opinions. His focus stayed narrow. Work hard, raise his son right. Raise his, stay out of trouble. That was the code he lived by, especially in a town where everyone watched everyone else. The woman arrived one early spring morning, her moving truck kicking dust into the air as it pulled into the small house near the ranch's outer road. She was white, early 30s, with a tired grace about her, like someone who had been strong for too long without rest. She wore black more often than not in those first weeks, even when the sun climbed high. The town learned quickly why her husband had died suddenly. No long illness, no warning. One moment alive, the next gone. She had followed the land here because it was his dream, a quieter place, a fresh start. Now she stood in it alone, carrying grief like something fragile and heavy at the same time. They noticed each other the way neighbors often do, not through conversation at first, but through patterns. He saw her lights stay on late into the night during his patrols, saw her sit on the porch some evenings, staring at the fields as if waiting for something to return. She noticed him walking the fence line, steady and unhurried, the ranch radio crackling softly at his shoulder. They exchanged polite nods at first, nothing more in a town like this. Too much friendliness too soon invited speculation, and both of them were already under quiet scrutiny. Him as the single father, her as the grieving widow. The church played its role as it always did. Women brought casseroles to her door, standing just long enough to assess her sadness before whispering prayers. Men shook her hand firmly, offering condolences mixed with advice. Lean on the Lord, time heals. Family members visited from out of town, filling her small house with voices and expectations. Some stayed too long, some left too quickly. What lingered was the silence afterward, the kind that pressed in at night when memories got loud. From his house across the way. The security guard sometimes paused during patrol and looked toward her place, not out of curiosity, but concern. He knew that silence. He lived with a version of it himself, and though he didn't know it yet. The distance between their houses was smaller than the space grief was about to close. If you watch till this point, thank you. Before we continue, take a moment and comment where you're watching from. Sometimes knowing we're not alone makes these stories hit a little deeper. The first real interaction didn't happen in daylight or after church or during one of those polite moments where words were expected. It happened on a night when the wind pressed hard against the ranch fences and the sky hung low and heavy, threatening rain. His patrol had been long already. The radio crackled with routine check-ins and his flashlight swept across familiar ground. Gates locked, barn secure, nothing out of place. By the time he headed back toward his small house on the edge of the property, Exhaustion sat deep in his bones. He was thinking about his son asleep inside, about reheated dinner waiting on the stove, about how quiet his life had become. That was when he saw her porch light flicker on, then off, then on again. It was a small thing, easy to ignore, but something in the way the light hesitated made him slow his steps. Inside her house, the silence had turned sharp, the kind that made every creak sound like a warning. She stood in her kitchen, staring at the sink, water pooling beneath a leaking pipe. She didn't know how to stop. Her husband had always handled things like this, not because she couldn't learn, but because they had fallen into those small, unspoken roles couples do. Now every drip felt like proof of his absence. She had tried tightening the valve herself, hands shaking, breath shallow. The water kept coming. Panic rose, not loud, but insistent. Her phone lay on the counter. She scrolled through contacts she didn't feel ready to use. Family would worry, churchwomen would talk, and then she thought of the man across the way. The security guard. The father. The one who walked the fence every night like the world depended on it. She hesitated long enough to feel foolish, then grabbed her coat. When the knock came, it was soft at first, almost apologetic. He opened the door expecting wind and found her standing there instead. Rain beginning to mist her hair, eyes wide with something between embarrassment and desperation. For a second, neither of them spoke. In towns like this, appearances mattered. A white widow at night, a black man opening his door alone. Both of them understood the weight of the moment instantly. "I'm sorry," she said finally, voice tight. "I wouldn't bother you this late, but my sink won't stop leaking." I didn't know who else to ask. He saw the tremor in her hands, the way she kept glancing over her shoulder as if the darkness itself was listening. He stepped aside without hesitation. "It's fine," he said calmly. "Let me grab my tools." He followed her back across the gravel path, mindful of the space between them, of the way eyes might look if anyone happened to glance out a window. Inside her kitchen, the air felt different, stale, heavy with grief and detergent and memories. He knelt beneath the sink, working quietly, asking simple questions to keep her grounded. She stood nearby, arms folded, explaining more than necessary, apologizing again, mentioning her husband, stopping herself mid-sentence when the words became too sharp to continue. He didn't rush her, didn't feel the silence. He fixed the pipe with steady hands, the kind that had learned patience through long nights and responsibility. When the water finally stopped, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. She insisted on offering something, tea, coffee, anything, but he declined gently, glancing at the clock. His son would be stirring soon, still, before he left. She spoke again, quieter this time. "Thank you," she said. "I didn't realize how hard it would be, not having someone to call." He met her eyes then, not long enough to invite misunderstanding, but long enough to let her feel seen. "You don't have to carry everything alone," he said. The words surprised them both. Outside, the rain finally began to fall in earnest, tapping against the roof like punctuation, and as he walked back to his house, he felt it. That subtle shift, the sense that something small and human had begun. Not romance. Not yet. Just the breaking of silence. The days after that night slipped into a cautious rhythm, one shaped by restraint rather than familiarity. They did not suddenly become close, nor did they pretend the knock on his door had not happened. Instead, something quieter took root and awareness. He noticed when her curtains stayed drawn until midday. She noticed when his patrols ran later than usual, his silhouette passing beneath the ranch lights long after the town had gone still. When they crossed paths, their conversations remained brief, polite, almost careful. A nod by the mailbox, A soft good morning at the edge of the gravel road, in a town where stories traveled faster than facts. Both of them understood the importance of moving slowly, yet beneath that restraint, something had shifted. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt watched. Her grief deepened in waves, unpredictable and unforgiving. Some mornings she woke convinced she could manage, moving through her house with purpose, answering messages from church women who checked in daily, attending Sunday service and sitting stiffly through sermons about endurance and God's timing. Other days, the house felt unbearable. The rooms were too large, the corners too quiet, every object reminding her of what had been lost. Her husband's jacket still hung by the door. His boots sat by the wall untouched. Family called often urging her to come stay with them to leave the ranch behind. A woman shouldn't be alone like this. Her sister said people will talk, her aunt warned. Even at church, the looks carried meaning, sympathy layered with expectation. She was a widow now, and widows in their eyes had a certain way they were supposed to behave. He felt the pressure too, though it came dressed differently. At church, a few men clapped him on the shoulder a little too hard, asking how he was holding up as a single father, reminding him that children needed structure and strong guidance. One older deacon suggested he volunteer more, be more visible. People respect a man who stays in his lane. The man said with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He understood what that meant. In this town, his role was clear and narrow. Security guard, father, quiet man who didn't attract attention. Being seen too often near a grieving white woman could turn kindness into suspicion. He had lived long enough to know how quickly narratives could form without his permission. It was a week later when the call came. Not a knock this time, but a message sent just after midnight. He had finished his patrol and was sitting at the kitchen table reviewing his son's homework for the morning when his phone buzzed. The message was short, almost hesitant. "I'm sorry to bother you again. I can't sleep. The house feels too quiet." He stared at the screen longer than he meant to. He thought of his son asleep in the next room, of the rules he had built his life around. He thought of the looks at church, of the way kindness could be twisted. But he also thought of the night she stood in his doorway, rain in her hair, holding herself together by will alone. He replied simply, "I'm awake. Do you need me to come over?" The pause before her response felt heavy. Then, "Would you mind just sitting for a bit? I don't want to be alone." He arrived with distance in his posture and intention in his steps. He stayed near the doorway at first, careful not to cross lines that didn't need crossing. They sat at opposite ends of the living room, the only light coming from a small lamp she hadn't turned off since her husband's death. She talked, not in a rush, but in fragments, about the night she lost him, about the sound the house made afterward, about the fear that crept in when the lights went out. He listened the way he had learned to listen years ago, without interruption, without solutions. When her voice cracked, he didn't rush to fix it. When she cried, he let the silence hold them both. Time passed unnoticed until she looked at the clock and whispered, almost ashamed, "I don't think I can face the night alone." The request hovered between them, heavy with implication. He thought of his son again, of what staying might mean, and of what leaving might do. He stayed, not in her bedroom, not close enough to invite misunderstanding. He took the chair by the window, sitting where he could see the porch light glow against the dark. Outside, the ranch lay quiet, the fences standing guard, as they always did. Inside, something fragile settled into place. Her breathing slowed. The house, for the first time in days, felt occupied. When morning came, it brought more than light. It brought consequence. He left before dawn, slipping out unnoticed. But the town had a way of sensing change. And as the church bells rang that Sunday, both of them would feel it. the weight of staying and the cost that was sure to follow. Morning light didn't erase what had happened. It sharpened it. When he stepped back into his house just before sunrise, the air felt heavier than it had the night before. His son was still asleep, sprawled across the bed in the way children do when they feel safe. He stood in the doorway longer than necessary, watching the slow rise and fall of his chest, grounding himself. Nothing improper had happened, nothing reckless, and yet, he knew better than to believe intention would matter more than perception in towns like this. People didn't need proof. They needed only suggestion. By the time he brewed his coffee, his thoughts were already racing ahead to church, to work, to the sideways glances that would come if anyone decided to connect dots that weren't theirs to connect. She woke later, the house bathed in pale morning light, confused for a moment by the unfamiliar calm in her chest. For the first time since her husband's death, the night had passed without panic clawing at her throat. Then memory returned slow and insistent. The chair by the window, his quiet presence, the way he had stayed without asking for anything in return. Gratitude followed quickly, but so did fear. Her phone buzzed with messages she hadn't answered yet. Her sister reminding her to be careful, a churchwoman asking if she would be attending the widow's support meeting that afternoon. A message from her mother that read simply, "People are talking. Protect yourself." She hadn't told anyone about the night. She hadn't needed to. The town seemed to sense things before they were spoken. At work, the ranch felt different to him, too. Not the land. It was the same wide stretch of open field and worn fence posts, but the people. A coworker lingered longer than usual during the morning briefing, asking casual questions about his night patrol. Another joked lightly about keeping an eye on everything, his smile sharp around the edges. He answered carefully, giving nothing away. Still, he felt it. The shift in tone, the subtle narrowing of space. By lunchtime, a supervisor pulled him aside, not to accuse, but to advise. "You're a good man," the older white ranch manager said, voice low. "Just remember this place has eyes. Folks, expect a certain order." He nodded, swallowing the familiar frustration. Order, he knew, often meant knowing when to step back, even when stepping forward was the right thing. Church that Sunday felt heavier than usual. She arrived alone, dressed modestly, sitting where she always did. He came later with his son, sliding into the back pew. They did not look at each other, not because they didn't want to, but because restraint had become necessary. The sermon was about boundaries, about resisting temptation, about appearances and testimony. Every word landed too close to home. When the service ended, she was surrounded almost immediately. Women offering prayers that felt like inspections, questions wrapped in concern. "Are you managing on your own? You know you should lean on the church." One woman leaned closer and whispered, "Be careful who you trust right now." Across the room, he watched men shake his pastor's hand, eyes flicking toward him and then away. He left quickly after, his son tugging at his hand, unaware of the weight settling on his father's shoulders. The distance between the houses grew, not physically, but emotionally. He stopped walking past her porch during patrol, choosing longer routes. She kept her curtains closed, even in the afternoon. When they did speak, it was brief and necessary. A text about mail left in the wrong box, a polite exchange near the driveway. Both of them felt the loss of what had brought peace, yet neither spoke of it. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the field in gold, she stood at her window and watched him secure the outer gate. For a moment, she almost called out, almost crossed the space that fear had rebuilt. But the voices echoed louder than her heart. Family expectations, church standards, the unspoken rules of a town that preferred grief neat. and kindness contained. She stepped back instead, and in the quiet that followed, both of them understood the truth they hadn't yet named. Compassion had consequences, and the cost of being seen together was only beginning. Tom did not move forward so much as it stretched. Days passed, then weeks, each one settling into the space left by words unsaid. He returned to routine with a precision that bordered on discipline. Early patrols, quiet meals, evenings spent helping his son with schoolwork before bed. From the outside, nothing about his life had changed. But inside, the absence of those late-night conversations weighed heavier than exhaustion ever had. He caught himself listening for her porch light during his rounds, then forcing his gaze away. He reminded himself why distance mattered. He had a child watching his choices, a reputation that had been carefully built and could be undone with a single rumor. Kindness. He was learning. Had boundaries, whether you wanted them or not. For her. The isolation deepened. The church visit slowed, not out of cruelty, but out of expectation that grief had a schedule. The casserole stopped coming. The messages became less frequent. She attended the widow's support meetings when guilt pushed her through the doors, sitting in circles where stories were shared in neat arcs of sorrow and recovery. Her grief didn't fit those shapes at home. She baked when the silence grew loud, filling the house with warmth that faded too quickly. She left loaves on church doorsteps, dropped pies at neighbors' homes, trying to remain visible without inviting scrutiny. Yet the quiet persisted. The one presence that had studied her most, the man who had stayed without asking, remained just out of reach. The town, however, did not forget. Did not. Whispers found corners to gather in. At the feed store, in church hallways, near the school pickup line. Nothing was said outright, but implications hung thick in the air. A ranch worker mentioned seeing him near her house late one night. Someone else questioned why she hadn't moved back home with family like a sensible woman. He felt it when conversation stalled as he approached. She felt it in the way smiles tightened when she entered a room. No accusation needed to be voiced. The damage lived in suggestion. Even her family added weight, calling more often now, pressing harder. You need to think about how this looks. People will assume things. Your husband's memory deserves respect. She wanted to scream that grief didn't erase the need for comfort. Instead, she said nothing. One evening, after a long patrol, he found something unexpected on his porch, a small paper bag tied with twine. Inside was a loaf of bread, still warm, the scent familiar and grounding. No note, no explanation. He stood there longer than necessary, letting the moment settle. She had found a way to reach out without crossing the lines drawn around them. He understood the message in its quiet simplicity. I remember. I'm grateful. I'm still here. That night, after his son was asleep, he brewed coffee and sat at the table staring at the loaf, feeling the ache of restraint. He wanted to knock on her door to tell her she didn't have to retreat so completely, but he didn't. Wanting and doing were different things now, days later. She found a small bag on her porch in return. Coffee beans wrapped carefully, a blend she had once mentioned liking during one of their early conversations. Again, no note, no trace of presence, just the reminder that kindness could exist without being seen. These exchanges continued, quiet and deliberate. Bread, coffee, a bouquet of wildflowers left carefully by her steps. Each gesture small enough to avoid gossip, meaningful enough to ease the ache of distance. They spoke less, but understood more, and in the fragile balance between caution and care, something steady began to form. Not romance, not yet, but trust that survived scrutiny. The town might watch, the church might whisper. But in the space between kindness and rumor, they found a way to hold on without letting go. The town began to move on in the way small towns always do, not because wounds were healed, but because attention shifted. New gossip surfaced. Another family faced trouble. A sermon series changed. The pressure didn't vanish, but it loosened just enough to let them breathe. He noticed at first during patrols when coworkers stopped lingering near the end of his shifts, when conversations returned to weather and work instead of half-formed questions. He still kept his distance, still measured his steps carefully, but the tension no longer sat in his chest every waking moment. Healing, he realized, often came disguised as fatigue lifting rather than joy arriving. Her healing looked different. It came in small acts of courage she barely noticed at first. Opening the curtains in the morning, letting sunlight touch the places grief had claimed, sitting on the porch again, even when neighbors passed by. She still dressed simply, still carried her loss visibly, but she no longer shrank beneath it. At church, she sang softly one Sunday, surprising herself when her voice didn't break. The older women noticed, too. Their glances softened, their questions turned gentler. Loss, when allowed to breathe, slowly earned respect. Still, there were moments when the house closed in, when memories grew louder at night. Those were the nights she brewed tea and thought of the man across the field, wondering how he carried so much weight without complaint. Their first real conversation in weeks happened by accident. A loose section of fence along the ranch line had given way during a storm, and she found him there one late afternoon, tightening wire with practiced hands. She stopped at a careful distance, unsure if she was crossing an unspoken line simply by standing there. He looked up, surprised, then smiled. Not wide, not careless, but warm. "Fence gave up," he said lightly. She nodded, gesturing toward the leaning post. "My husband always said, 'Fences tell you when they're tired,'" she replied before she could stop herself. The words hung there, fragile. He didn't rush past them. He nodded once. "Some things hold longer than we expect," he said. And just like that, the wall between them thinned. They talked while he worked, keeping their voices low, the conversation grounded in ordinary things. The weather, her garden, his son's school project. There was comfort in the normally in speaking without explaining or defending. She apologized at one point for pulling away, for letting fear decide her actions. He stopped her gently. "You did what you needed to survive." He said, "There's no apology in that." The sincerity in his voice settled something in her chest she hadn't known was still unsettled. When the fence was secure, neither of them rushed to leave. They stood there, the late sun stretching shadows across the field, the quiet between them no longer sharp. That evening, she invited him to stay. Not overnight, not hidden, not secretive, just dinner. She framed it carefully, knowing the rules that still existed. He hesitated, thinking of his son, of the eyes that still watched. Then he nodded. "I'll bring him," he said. It was a small decision with large meaning. Dinner happened early with windows open and lights on. Her table filled with food and soft conversation. His son laughed easily, grounding the moment in innocence. There was no tension, no secrecy, just people sharing space honestly, and in that openness, something shifted again. Silence, once heavy with restraint, began to heal instead of hurt. The evening they shared dinner did not end with promises or declarations. It ended with dishes washed, his son thanking her politely, and the three of them standing on the porch as dusk settled over the ranch. Yet the simplicity of that night carried weight far beyond its quiet moments. For him, bringing his child into her home had been a decision rooted in honesty. It said without words that he had nothing to hide. For her, opening her door with the lights on, neighbors in view, was its own kind of bravery. By morning, both of them felt it. The line between caution and fear had begun to blur, and they would have to decide which one would guide them forward. Church. The following Sunday felt different. They arrived separately as they always had, but this time they did not avoid each other's presence. When the final hymn ended and people turned to greet one another, she found herself standing beside him near the aisle. Their exchange was brief, respectful, unmistakably public. A few heads turned, a few brows lifted. Then the moment passed. The sky did not fall. No whispers erupted on the spot. Instead, a woman from the choir smiled at her, warm and genuine, and an older man nodded at him with quiet approval. The absence of immediate judgment felt like relief, but also like challenge. If they were going to move forward, it would be in the open or not at all. The real test came from family. Her sister visited that afternoon, sitting stiffly at the kitchen table, eyes sharp with concern. She spoke carefully at first about grief, about vulnerability, about how quickly people misunderstood things in small towns. Then she said it plainly. "You're being watched," she warned. "And he's not just anyone. People will talk." The implication hung there heavy and unfair. For the first time since her husband's death, she pushed back. "I am allowed kindness," she said quietly, "and I am allowed to heal in my own time." Her sister studied her, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. It wasn't defiance. It was resolve. When the conversation ended, nothing was fully resolved, but something had shifted. She had chosen herself. He faced his own reckoning days later when the ranch manager asked to speak with him again. This time, the conversation was more direct, though still cloaked in civility. "You know how this place is," the man said. "Optics matter." He listened without interrupting, then responded calmly. "I do my job well. I raise my son right. I don't cause trouble." It wasn't a challenge. It was a boundary. The manager nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his words. Being seen, he realized, didn't always require permission. Sometimes it required quiet confidence. Their time together increased, not in secret, not in haste, but steadily. Walks along the fence line in the early evening. Shared meals that included laughter and silence in equal measure. Conversations about her husband that no longer felt forbidden. He never rushed her grief, never tried to replace what had been lost. She in turn respected the weight of his responsibilities, the way his life had been shaped by both love and caution. They were learning each other not as an escape, but as companions navigating difficult terrain, and in that mutual respect, trust deepened. The town noticed. Of course. Some washed with curiosity, some with quiet approval, some with lingering doubt. But what mattered most was what changed within them. Fear loosened its grip. Shame faded. In its place grew something steadier. Courage. Not the loud kind, not the kind that demanded attention, the kind that showed up consistently in daylight and truth. By choosing to be seen, they were choosing more than each other. They were choosing a life where kindness didn't have to hide, and where healing could finally step into the open. By the time autumn settled fully over the ranch, healing had begun to show itself in ways neither of them had planned for. It wasn't loud or celebratory. It lived in routines, in the way she no longer flinched when the wind rattled the windows at night, in the way he found himself laughing more easily, his shoulders no longer carrying quite so much weight when he came home from patrol. The land itself seemed to mirror the change. Fields turning gold, fences standing firm, the air cooler but calmer. What they were building did not erase the past. It made room for it. And that she was learning was what true healing allowed. Her home changed first. The heaviness that had once lingered in every room began to lift. Not because her husband was forgotten, but because his memory had found a place that no longer demanded all of her breath. She packed away some of his clothes with care, keeping what mattered and letting go of what hurt to hold. On Sundays, she still attended church, but now she stayed after service, joining conversations without feeling like an exhibit of grief. The whispers had softened into acceptance, helped along by time and by the visible honesty of her choices. People could debate in private, but in public, they had learned to respect her strength. For him, the change was clearest at home. His son asked questions now about why they visited her house, about why she sometimes sat with them at dinner. He answered simply truthfully. "She's someone we care about," he said. "And she cares about us." There was no fear in the explanation, no warning attached, just openness. The boy accepted it easily, as children often do when adults don't complicate things. Watching that trust unfold reminded him why he had chosen the path he did. Living carefully was important. Living honestly was more important. They spoke more openly now about what they were and what they were not. One evening, sitting on her porch as the sun dipped low, she finally said it aloud. "I'm afraid sometimes," she admitted. "Not of you, of what it means to move forward." He nodded, understanding more than she could know. "Moving forward doesn't mean leaving anything behind," he replied. "It just means you don't walk alone." The words settled between them like a promise, not of certainty, but of patience. They were not rushing toward labels or futures shaped by expectation. They were letting connection grow at the pace healing demanded. When winter hinted at its arrival, the town gathered for a small church event. Nothing elaborate, just lights strung in the hall and food laid out on long tables. They arrived together this time, not making an announcement, not hiding either. His son ran ahead to join other children. She stood beside him, steady and unashamed. A few people watched. A few smiled. Most simply carried on. And in that ordinariness, she felt something she hadn't felt since before the loss. Belonging without performance. Healing, she realized, didn't ask her to forget who she had been. It asked her to trust who she was becoming. Winter arrived gently, as if the land itself understood the need for care. The first snow came overnight, thin and soft, settling over the ranch fences and rooftops without disruption. He woke early as always, but this time there was a calm waiting for him that hadn't been there before. His son pressed his face to the window, excited by the white fields, and he found himself smiling without effort, across the way. Her porch light glowed faintly in the early morning, steady and warm. It was a small thing, but it mattered. Life had not returned to what it once was. It had become something new, something quieter. And in that quiet, there was peace. She spent that morning baking, the scent of bread and cinnamon filling the house. It no longer felt like she was baking to fight silence, but to welcome presence. When she stepped outside later, bundled against the cold, she paused to take in the view. The ranch, the snow, the familiar path between their homes. Grief still lived within her, but it no longer ruled her. It had softened, reshaped itself into memory rather than pain. She knew now that loving again did not erase the love she had lost. It honored it by proving her heart was still capable of warmth. That truth had taken time, courage, and more restraint than she ever imagined. But it had brought her here, standing in a moment that felt whole. The town adjusted in its own way. People grew accustomed to seeing them together, sometimes walking with his son, sometimes sitting side by side at church events, sometimes simply existing within the same spaces without explanation. The gossip faded, replaced by something less dramatic and more enduring: familiarity. Even her family softened, seeing the steadiness in her eyes, the return of laughter to her voice. They might not have understood everything, but they no longer questioned her strength. His world changed, too, at the ranch. trust replaced caution. At home, his son spoke freely about the future, about plans and ideas that included her naturally. The life he had built carefully, brick by brick, had made room without collapsing. One evening, as the year edged toward its end, they stood together, watching the sun dip behind the fields, the sky painted in pale winter colors. There was no rush in the moment, no need to define what came next. They spoke instead of ordinary things, repairs that needed doing, meals they wanted to try, the way seasons always seemed to move faster than expected, in the silence between words. There was understanding. They had walked through grief, pressure, judgment, and fear without letting any of it harden them. What remained was trust earned, tested, and quietly strong. And so the story did not end with grand declarations or perfect certainty. It ended with something better. Two people who had learned that healing does not demand forgetting and love does not require haste. Sometimes the most powerful thing is simply staying present, staying kind, staying honest when the world is watching. If this story moved you, take a moment and share where you're watching from. And remember this, peace isn't about erasing the past. It's about carrying it gently into what comes next.